Good day, and welcome to Nature's Returns, a webinar speaker series hosted by the Yale Center for Business and the Environment. My name is Karina Mahong, and I will be your host for today's webinar titled Using New Technologies to Identify Landscape-Scale Conservation and Restoration Priorities. The Yale Center for Business and the Environment, or CBE, is pleased to continue Nature's Returns, a webinar series that addresses the growing importance of ecosystem valuation and investment. Each presentation is recorded and available on YouTube and Yale iTunes U. We are also excited to share news of a new partnership between CBE and the Conservation Finance Network. This initiative will provide original content and share timely news, events, and resources on conservation finance online. The Conservation Finance Network seeks to accelerate land conservation and restoration with financial tools and strategies. By providing training and building a network of professionals across the conservation, finance, and philanthropic sectors, CFN increases the financial resources deployed for conservation. Today, we have Jeff Allenby, who will discuss the new high-resolution datasets and web-based analysis tools that the Chesapeake Conservancy is developing. These tools streamline the efforts of conservation and restoration organizations, allowing them to quickly prioritize efforts and model the potential benefits of projects. Jeff will further explore how the Conservancy is working to integrate these tools into ecosystem service markets in the Chesapeake Bay, aiming to improve water quality while helping finance conservation and restoration projects using market-based solutions. Before we begin the presentation, we would like to remind our listeners that questions are welcomed and will be directed to our speaker at the conclusion of the talk. You can type questions directly into the GoToMeeting chat window. And with that, we welcome Jeff to Nature's Returns.
Thank you very much, Karina. Welcome to everyone on the talk today. My name is Jeff Allenby. I'm the Director of Conservation Technology at the Chesapeake Conservancy. We are a regional watershed organization based in the Chesapeake Bay. For those of you who aren't familiar with it, we're on the East Coast. And it's about a 64,000 square mile watershed going from Cooperstown, New York to almost the North Carolina-Virginia border, spanning 6 states in the District of Columbia. We got our start around the Captain John Smith Chesapeake National Historic Trail, which is a 3,000 plus mile water trail and goes throughout the watershed, as you can see in the map here. It follows John Smith's explorations in the early 1600s and is the nation's first all-water national historic trail, really following his journeys and providing a backbone for conservation and restoration work throughout the Chesapeake Bay watershed. The Chesapeake Conservancy has 3 main focuses: connecting people to the Chesapeake Bay. We do that through a lot of creating new public access sites or digital initiatives, working to conserve important landscapes along the rivers of the Chesapeake, trying to ensure that we have good riparian corridors and really beautiful places to paddle, and where we don't have those areas, working to restore those landscapes. And across all of this, we've really focused on innovation as a way to address conservation and restoration challenges in new ways. It's not to say that the old ways of doing things are bad, but there's definitely room for innovation, and kind of research and development within the conservation and restoration worlds hasn't necessarily seen the investment that it has in other industries. And we were lucky to be able to have some of those funding and those opportunities, and have really pushed the bounds on the use of technology within conservation and restoration technology. Everything that we do is through partnerships, so we're working with a number of state and federal agencies, including the Chesapeake Bay Program, which is a state-federal partnership between federal agencies led by the EPA, as well as the Park Service, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, NOAA, USGS, Army Corps of Engineers, and they are really tasked with restoration efforts within the Chesapeake Bay and coordinating those efforts. So about 3.5 years ago, The Chesapeake Conservancy was a very small organization at the time. We were 5 people working along a 3,000-mile water trail and a 64,000 square mile watershed. And we quickly realized that we needed to have a better understanding of what land needed protection, what land needed restoration. So we started our Conservation Innovation Center, which is developing new tools and resources to help all of our programs, and in many cases our partners' programs, become more effective and more efficient with the funding that they have. We're doing this through developing new low-cost water quality monitoring sensors and partnering with the EPA and American University on that. We're working on interactive web mapping and ways to get this data into the hands of people who need it, who may not have GIS skills or more technology skills. Precision conservation is a lot of what I'll be talking about, as well as some indicator species assessments, and seeing how all of these different things combine together to tell us where we should be working and where our partners should be working across a landscape. The concept of precision conservation seems pretty simple at its core. It's getting the right practices in the right places at the right scale at the right time and making sure that they're working. This would be very easy to do if you had all the staff time in the world and you could send field staff out and they could walk every stream corridor and figure out what needs to be done where. As we all know, that's not the case. We're never going to have enough field staff to be able to do that. So we really wanted to look at it from the perspective of how can technology help us find shortcuts or identify these important landscapes as easily as possible, as quickly as possible, as cheaply as possible from a desktop setting that can then inform that field staff kind of where the general areas that you need to go to then have that field staff confirm it and validate it in the field. We wrote a number of different reports, and these are available on our website at chesapeakeconservancy.org/reports. But looking at what is the role that technology can play, what new technologies are out there, the report on the left here was a survey of kind of about 25 to 30 experts from around the country saying what's the coolest new technology out there and how could it be applied to the conservation world. The second report was actually implementing it and saying, could we do this as a small resource limited nonprofit? And the third is looking at kind of a similar survey of those gaps in the water quality monitoring segment. What we found is that there is definitely the potential for a small resource limited nonprofit to do this type of work, and there's a great amount that you can learn from it. So 2 of the things that we're focusing on is high resolution land cover classifications and concentrated flow path analyses. And what we're doing is we're using existing aerial imagery and LiDAR elevation data to get a much better understanding of what's going on in the landscape and what the potential impacts of restoration projects or conservation projects would be on both natural landscapes as well as water quality and providing those ecosystem services. So the first one, talking about this high-resolution land cover classification, what we're doing is we're translating 1 meter resolution aerial imagery and LiDAR into a 1 meter land cover classification. For those of you who are familiar with land cover and kind of GIS, you may know about the National Land Cover data set. And this is a 30 meter resolution data set that's been generated every 5 years or so from Landsat, which is 30 meter data. What we're doing is taking that 30 meter data, we're using different imagery, but bringing the resolution down to 1 meter, so about a 900 times increase in the resolution. We're also going from about a 78% accuracy to over a 90% accuracy. So we're improving both the resolution and the accuracy that allows you to start to make those decisions on a parcel scale or a subparcel scale instead of focusing on a watershed scale or a county scale. So as we start to get into the implementation phase of a lot of our restoration efforts, we have the information where we can really get in close and figure out exactly what projects we should be doing and what the expected returns from those projects are. As you can see, these are the general classes that we're pulling out on the left. You can definitely pull out different classes using different algorithms as well. Very generally what we're doing is we're training the computer to make the same decisions that your eye makes when you look at an image. If you are looking, you can easily pull out what's forest or what's barren or what's a road or what's a building. We're using some new technologies to make those same decisions at a much faster scale across much larger landscapes. We're currently processing this data for the entire Chesapeake Bay watershed through a partnership with the Bay Program and the University of Vermont and another company called Worldview Solutions in Virginia. So we'll soon, at the end of May, have wall-to-wall 1 meter resolution land cover for the entire Chesapeake Bay watershed and all of the counties that touch the Chesapeake Bay watershed. Just to give you an idea of what the impact of having this data is, this image right here is the current national land cover data set, that 30-meter data I was referring to before. This is the same landscape with our data. So you can start to see a lot of features as I flip back and forth between the 30-meter data and the 1-meter data. You know, along the river corridor, you actually have fairly good tree cover along a lot of it. With that 30-meter data, a lot of that doesn't come up. So if you're doing models on riparian buffer completeness, you're saying this river doesn't have a lot of riparian corridor, you know, the riparian buffer, when in reality it does have a good amount of riparian buffer, and looking at that information. So it's allowing us to be able to get a more accurate understanding of what's on the landscape, but it's also allowing us to plug this information into models to understand what are the subwatersheds that we need to be working in, and within those subwatersheds, what are the parcels, or what are the very small landscapes, or even within a parcel, that we might need to be working on for that restoration work. What we can do after that is combine the land cover. We can also take that LiDAR elevation data, and for those of you who aren't familiar with LiDAR, it is collected, that's kind of the series of images along the bottom of the screen. It's collected by flying a plane and bouncing a high-speed laser off the ground to generate this point cloud of returns, and you can triangulate essentially with a very high resolution what the elevation of that ground is. From there we can create a surface that has that elevation data and then calculate how water is flowing across a landscape. Now the importance of this is that a lot of restoration efforts or agricultural best management practices or suburban best management practices say that you need to have, you know, a fixed width buffer. You know, you need to have a 35-foot buffer or a 50-foot buffer along the entire edge of a field or along the entire edge of a road. In reality, because of those small changes in elevation, some of that buffer might be receiving the majority of the surface flow coming off that landscape, and other places may really not be receiving that much. So what you can do is you can actually design a variable width buffer based on that flow accumulation data to maximize the water quality benefits coming out of that, and saying in this small area we may actually need to have a 100-foot buffer instead of a 50-foot buffer or a 35-foot buffer, but in other areas you may be able to have a 15-foot buffer and put land back into production. Or if you're only going to be doing a buffer in a very small area, you can focus on the areas of where that is. Again, this is a comparison. The image here, the blue lines are the National Hydrographic Data Set, which is the USGS waters of the US. They're the official stream channels. And the orange lines are those concentrated flow paths that we've been able to generate going up into the landscape beyond where you have a stream channel to say, where is water starting to concentrate before it reaches that stream channel? Because if you're going to be implementing a best management practice, that information really matters, and you can begin to prioritize where in the landscape or where, you know, along the edge of a field you want to take action to maximize the benefits coming out of that. The goal for this is to have, you know, a real win-win where we're minimizing the impacts to landowners while minimizing the cost of implementing projects because you can focus them where they need to be, while also maximizing the ecosystem benefits and the water quality benefits coming out of it. Just as a clarification on this image as well, you know, these orange lines are not saying that you have a stream channel through all of these areas. It's just where it's concentrating, and it's not saying that you need to do some sort of treatment along all of these lines. It's just saying where those lines are intersecting your stream channels, that might be an ideal place to work. What we're currently doing is working on a partnership with a number of different companies, including Esri and Microsoft Research and an imagery company called Hexagon Geospatial, to translate the workflow that we have for our high-resolution land cover that we've done, you know, in the Chesapeake, which is a large landscape, but nothing compared to the Mississippi or the Great Lakes or somewhere else. The goal is to be able to streamline this process and speed it up exponentially. And we're well in that process. We currently are working on a pilot project in a landscape in the Chesapeake and a landscape out west. We're just starting that up, but should have those results in the next couple of months to be able to say, you know, feasibly, could you do a nationwide high-resolution land cover data set? And what it's looking like is that's very feasible and could provide this level of information across the country or where you have that high-resolution imagery. One of the nice things that we can do is once we have both that elevation data and the flow path information and the land cover, is you can begin to weight your flow accumulations to get a better understanding of where the most important landscapes are for restoration. You can, you know, just weight it directly, but what we're doing is we're creating both what we're calling a normalized difference flow index. And what this is doing is comparing the unweighted to the weighted flow accumulation and saying where are the landscapes where you have the highest expectation for nutrient and sediment loads beyond what would normally be there. So you can prioritize both on the volume coming through as well as how far from normal it is. This is done across the entire watershed depending on the color ramp you put on it. You know, in this case, the red areas are your priorities, the green areas are not as big of a priority, and it allows you to really go in and focus on an individual property or across an entire landscape and understand where potentially you should be working based on what your goals are for that.
For those in the audience that are just joining us, Jeff Allenby from the Chesapeake Conservancy is presenting on using new technologies to identify landscape scale conservation and restoration priorities. So far, we've established a need for precision conservation and its anticipated benefits for environmental management efforts. Jeff will now delve into how this fits into potential structures of a nutrient trading market.
Thanks, Karina. Yeah, so having new data is great, but unless you can actually use it to help direct where you're working or to help direct where your funding is going, it's really not that useful. So we're looking at a number of different ways that we can incorporate this data into management efforts. We're working with a couple of partners, including the District of Columbia's Urban Forestry Administration, to understand how green infrastructure projects and implementation can maximize reductions to the stormwater system in DC. For those of you who maybe have been following it, the District of Columbia is currently digging some giant tunnels under the city to temporarily hold stormwater before it can be passed on to their wastewater treatment facility. What they have found, though, is that is a very expensive process, and it is a lot cheaper to plant trees in the right places to reduce the amount of stormwater going into storm drains and to increase groundwater infiltration. So we are working with them to take this high-resolution data and to understand for all of the projects that they've already done, what is kind of the storm shed of that storm drain, what is the composition of the land cover in there, and what are the estimates for flow going to that, to kind of give a return on investment for all of the green infrastructure projects they've already done. The next step to that project is then to expand that to all the other storm drains across the District of Columbia and to prioritize where the next project should go. So you're doing performance-based funding and project implementation versus what's convenient, trying to maximize the benefits coming out of that. We're also working on some tools to be able to say if they're working on a given property or a park, if they're going to be planting trees as part of a restoration project, where should they plant those trees to intercept the most surface flow and to reduce that surface flow and have uptake from the sediment or the nutrients, retain the sediment as much as possible. Then also doing kind of some large-scale gap assessments and canopy assessments to understand where do they have good tree cover, where have they been losing it, where have they been gaining it, and where should they put their focus on planting new trees in those areas. On a suburban landscape, it's also just as important. We're working with a couple of counties right now to help develop tools that allow them to prioritize where across the landscape they should be doing stormwater restoration projects. And looking at that, we've built this web tool to be able to go through and say across the entire landscape has all of their parcels as well as all of the medians in the middle of the road, as well as the little slivers, like the area between the sidewalk and the road or between a parcel and a road, to be able to prioritize, and has about 45 variables built in, but allows them to quickly go through and figure out where potential projects could be located based on what they're trying to do. What a lot of this does is helps to identify quickly new opportunities for restoration efforts and how they may be able to build into existing efforts, enhancing those, as well as providing regional planning tools that allow you to connect existing patches of habitat, or really focus on providing green infrastructure as a solution to stormwater impacts versus hard engineered infrastructure. It's quickly allowing people to plan across the entire landscape, and what their engineering and public works departments are doing is using this tool to identify where they should send field staff out to do a site assessment. It's really streamlining the process, really facilitating how quickly they're identifying good projects to be able to put their funding and their financing into. The nice thing is you can do that, returns a table, so you can zoom to different things. Then you can also export that table as an Excel spreadsheet. So if you're not working in the GIS or the web GIS world, you can take that file, all of it's responsive, so you can view it on an iPad out in the field, all of that stuff. And an agricultural landscape too, you know, what it's doing is identifying opportunities for restoration efforts, or in some cases conservation efforts, at a parcel scale or even a subparcel scale to maximize the nutrient and sediment reductions from projects going into the ground. The Chesapeake Bay has a lot of issues with sedimentation and excess nutrients. And while it's coming from a number of different landscapes, agriculture is the largest producer of nutrient and sediment pollution. What we're doing is trying to work with the agricultural community, with the counties, with the states, with the federal agencies, to identify how we can achieve the nutrient and sediment reductions that we need to with as little effort, with as little money, with as little time, and with as little impact to landowners as possible. I have yet to meet a farmer who doesn't want to do the right thing, but oftentimes it's that balance between costs and benefits, between how much production and, you know, productive land am I going to lose, what's the cost going to be to me. What we're trying to do is minimize those impacts while maximizing the water quality benefits. By building these tools as well and doing this analysis, we're really leveraging multiple partners working in the same areas towards the same goals, and allowing a lot of this work to be coordinated, where before it was kind of scattershot or might not have been working towards the same goals. What we can do once we have this data too is we can identify regional conservation opportunities and priorities. This is the James River down in Virginia. We're currently working with 5 soil and water conservation districts, as well as a watershed organization, the James River Association, to identify where we have the best opportunities for riparian buffer restoration and cattle exclusion. And we just got a grant from the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation to work over the next 3 years to prioritize these restoration efforts in the watersheds that are highlighted. So a lot of these orange watersheds, we are now working to have very targeted restoration projects and very prioritized restoration projects where we are going to generate significant sediment reductions in particular, but where we have opportunities to reduce sediment loads coming through the watershed. We can also work to identify hotspots to target outreach and education. You know, this is analysis that we did for another watershed organization, taking the NDFI score, and what it's allowing you to do is go across the entire watershed and say, where are my best opportunities for conservation, where I have a really naturally high-functioning landscape that has forests and, you know, wetlands, and I want to make sure it remains natural. Or we can say, where are the best restoration potential? And in some cases, it's in a city, like this red blob kind of on the middle of the screen. But in other areas, some of those restoration potential is on a more rural landscape where you could be putting best management practices in. So it's allowing you to quickly go across the entire landscape and say, where are my priorities? On a parcel scale, tracking change. You know, just to show you an example, we have a couple of years of data sets in some of the watersheds that we're working now. Even over 2 years, to go from 2011 to 2013, you know, the land cover allows you to summarize and say, where have I seen the most change? You know, this is a new subdivision going in where it went from natural forest with one road to a number of houses, parking lots or driveways, stuff like that, you could summarize on a watershed to say what has the biggest amount of change, or you can even summarize down to the parcel scale. So if you're a land trust trying to monitor easements, you can say, where have I seen the most significant changes over this time period, and set thresholds. So show me all of the easements that have had at least a 30% drop in forest cover, or at least a 10% increase in impervious surfaces, to be able to go through and prioritize where you're doing field visits or something like that. Wildlife habitat monitoring is actually one of the big areas that we've seen a lot of interest as well for this data. Creating baselines for habitat connectivity models to identify priority habitats, but also track how they're changing over time, especially with climate change. Coastal ecosystems, wetlands, are changing very quickly, especially in the Chesapeake, and a lot of our partners are using models to estimate where those wetlands are going to migrate, where we're going to lose them. That's all based on that 30-meter data. With the 1-meter data, we're starting to see how that can be incorporated into these models to give a much better understanding of where wetland migration corridors may occur, or where the wetland loss that we may see is going to occur, so we can start to plan for a changing climate, changing sea level, and make sure that these really important habitats and ecosystems remain successful going into the future. Another really cool thing that you can do with that, with the time series down the road as we do this data over and over, is to be able to monitor the success or the implementation of habitat conservation, or in lots of cases best management practices. See, are those efforts having the intended consequences come out of them? If you're planting a riparian buffer, you can see 5 years down the road, 10 years down the road, is that buffer still there, or is it fallen to the wayside, hasn't been upkept, and really isn't providing the benefits that you think it is? Ecosystem services modeling is another really big one that's getting a lot of attention. With this resolution of data, you can get down to the level of estimating what the reductions are from a given project, or the loading rates of a given landscape, with a lot more accuracy by diving down with the resolution and improving the accuracy coming out of it. What we can do is, looking across the landscape, also identify specific landscapes that may be a priority for some of that restoration effort, that we want to make sure best management practices or ecosystem services are being focused in that area. Looking at healthy ecosystems too, I mentioned this before, I don't want to belabor the fact, but looking and saying, where do we have really good landscapes that are going to benefit from conservation efforts? Either easements or acquisitions, or making sure that these natural landscapes don't fall to the wayside and get degraded. Because a restored landscape is never going to be as good as the original natural landscape that was there. It can be better than a degraded landscape, but if we have something that's natural and amazing, we really want it to remain natural and amazing. And finally, stewardship and outreach tools. This is a way for us to provide information to our partners that will allow them to communicate with landowners, clearly communicate what the potential of their land is, or the impact of their land is, to be able to get that buy-in from them. So it's really providing, even down to individualized reports for a landowner detailing what's going on in their landscape and why it's important.
We've passed the midpoint of our webinar and welcome those just tuning in. Jeff has outlined tools for precision conservation and how they're contributing to local and regional environmental management efforts. In the next couple minutes, he will describe how the Chesapeake Conservancy is making planning and prioritization tools accessible to local partners. We would also like to remind our listeners that questions are welcomed and will be directed to our speaker at the conclusion of the talk. Please type them in the chat window.
Thanks, Karina. So again, having this information is great, but unless it's getting into the hands of the people who are working on the ground, it really isn't going to produce the results that you want out of it. So we're looking at a couple of different ways of addressing, how we are implementing best management practices, or how we're estimating nutrient and sediment reductions. One of the things that we can do is to look at a per project benefit, or a per project estimate. Where we're going in, calculating the area draining to a given project, looking at the land cover composition of it, bringing in loading rates, and this is all just numbers in this, but you can actually get down to a very good understanding of what the estimated nutrient sediment loading rates are, what the cost of that project is, to get kind of a return on investment or a cost-benefit analysis. We're currently working with the Chesapeake Bay program to bring in the efficiencies that are used for all of the modeling in the Chesapeake Bay with these new tools, to be able to create a web tool where you can go in, draw a project, say what it is, and provide the estimates coming back from what it's going to cost and what it's going to generate. We really see a lot of value in something like this to nutrient trading markets, where you can estimate the credits that would be generated from a given project and facilitate that process coming out. And then down the road, use that land cover to validate, is this project in place and is it doing what you think it's doing? Another way of doing it, and this is just kind of in a conceptual structure, is looking more at a sub-watershed estimation and kind of bringing all of the individual projects up into one larger category. From a nutrient trading aspect, again, trying to reduce transaction costs, you may be able to do that from the entire watershed and just say, we are going to try to reduce 50% of the nutrient and sediment coming out of this watershed, depending on which landowners want to get involved, which don't. Being able to summarize that and do those targeted projects across an entire watershed will allow you to bring everything up into potentially a more manageable structure from actually facilitating trading. Just because you're not going to do it on a project-by-project basis, the transaction costs will likely be too high. This might be a way to estimate across an entire watershed to generate, a number of credits for that watershed based on a certain amount of compliance or participation, and generate that. And then those people who participate could share within the benefits and the revenue generated from those credits. And then the other thing is making these accessible to our local partners. Now, we know a lot of different organizations may not have the most internal GIS capacity. The other thing looking at it is this is really big data. It has 900 times the resolution of the National Land Cover data set, but that also means that it's 900 times the amount of data as the National Land Cover data set. So that really can put some strain on local infrastructure. If you have an older computer that may not have as much power trying to run these analyses or identify this information or even bring it up in some cases can be really hard. So we're working to enable our partners through these web tools. And I'm actually going to attempt to do this live. I think it's more fun to do that. So, Karina, if you are still on the air, or anyone else, if you can just let me know whether you can see the screen as it changes. This is an example of one of our conservation toolboxes that we built for a local land trust down in the Richmond area, who's interested in a number of things. They work in the pink counties here, about 8 counties, and they had 2 staff who were both non-technical GIS people. And anytime a new parcel or a new project came in as a conservation easement or as an acquisition or as a restoration project, they had to evaluate its characteristics, and that usually consisted of calling a dozen different organizations to get some pretty basic information about what does this parcel contain or not contain. What we're able to do is we summarize that information for all 400,000 or so parcels across their service area to be able to look at the criteria they evaluate, like how many acres is it? Is it either protected or adjacent to protected land? What's the buffer length along the front of any stream channels along that? Is it in the floodplain? Does it have any historical resources? Is it in a scenic viewshed? What is the wetland restoration or conservation potential for that parcel? To be able to quickly allow our partners to access that information with a click of the mouse. So instead of it being a week-long process of calling back and forth to people, they can either search on a parcel ID or they can click on a parcel and quickly get that information summarized for them. We also built in a filter capability and can do this to be able to say, if I'm looking for parcels for a restoration project, I want at least 1,000 linear feet of buffer, but no more than 2,500 because that's what I can do with my volunteers in a weekend. And I want it to be less than 40% forested, and in a floodplain near a scenic byway. What this allows you to do is very quickly, with a couple clicks of a button, get back information. And this will return a list of parcels, hopefully in about 30 seconds if everything goes right. Give you a list of all of the parcels that meet your criteria. Now this can be customized on a number of different variables, criteria. You know, if a different partner is more focused on something else, we can run that analysis on the back end to give them access to that information on the front end to be able to very quickly and easily get that information back. As this is generating the results, it's always fun doing live demos, so I appreciate everyone's patience. One of the things that you can do is you can actually export it, again, like I said, as an Excel spreadsheet to be able to save this information and to take it home. It'll have the parcel numbers and the other criteria associated with it, which allows you to go through and be able to figure out after the fact if you need to go back and look at, you know, a different parcel or provide it to your field staff to be able to go out in the field and actually do surveys. So this is taking longer than I would like to load, so I'm going to move on. Another quick summary tool is looking at that high resolution land cover. And this is looking at both your entire parcel, which is the top one, it has acreages of each type of land cover, as well as the 35 and the 100-foot buffers. And we look at those two buffer widths because 35 is the regulatory requirement or regulatory ideal. From the conservation and restoration perspective, a lot of partners have agreed that at least 100 feet is more ideal. So looking at that and saying, you know, this one has 81% of the 35-foot buffer forested, which you can see looks true. And then, you know, within the 100-foot buffer, though, you have a lot more opportunities for restoration to say things are pretty good, but they could be better. Then one other thing that we like to have, which is really nice, is we can have a report generator. So because, again, not everything is going to be web-based, what you can do is customize, put in your report title, put in any notes. You can choose whether you want an imagery or a topographic base map, and it will create a PDF report for you. What this is going to allow you to do is print something off that's pre-formatted based on our partners' needs. So if they have a new parcel come in, they can create that report and put it into, you know, a submission packet later on to be able to quickly understand what's going on with that parcel. Summarizes all of this information, including the restoration potential on it. Again, usually it takes about a minute or so to be able to generate that. And what this is allowing us to do is create kind of presentation quality materials, or, you know, report quality materials, there you can see, very quickly and easily with a couple of clicks of a button. The goal is to make this accessible to our partners as possible, so you have access to that kind of complex GIS technology. The last one, which is currently in development, is a watershed delineation tool. So what this will allow you to do is you can either select a parcel, or you can draw a polygon, or you can drop a point and put a buffer around it, and say, using that LiDAR elevation data, calculate between 1 and 5 drainage areas on that parcel. And what it's going to do is query that flow accumulation data, find the point that has the largest drainage area coming to it on the parcel, and then delineate the watershed coming off of that. What we're working on currently is then summarizing, based on that drainage area, what is the land cover composition, so you can understand that, but then also build in the nutrient loading rates from the different land cover types to be able to estimate what the loads coming through any, you know, that point in the landscape potentially could be. So if you're designing a best management practice, or if you're designing a project, you can estimate what those loads are and design a project that will accommodate those loads appropriately. The goal, as much as possible, is to be very targeted, or very, you know, prioritize. You know, you can see in this case, this little corner of the parcel is draining about 3,600 acres, while this area over here that seems pretty innocuous, a little bit of a ditch, is draining over 100 acres of irrigated land. So it very quickly allows you to see kind of where on this property might you want to work first. With this case, with the 3,600 acres, it's really well forested, so there's probably not much that you can do right there. That portion of the parcel really doesn't have too much going to it, but you may really want to focus on this point over here because you'll get a much larger return. There's already a ditch that doesn't look like it's being farmed, so putting in kind of a two-stage ditch or a biochip nutrient reactor, some of those different best management practices could take advantage of the landscape. You could design it appropriately, and it could really provide you with valuable information quickly. You saw that took about a minute to do that. And as they continue to develop these tools, it will provide even more information about what's going on in this landscape, how many parcels does it span, and if you were to do a project, what would the estimated nutrient and sediment load reductions be coming off of that. So that is the end of my slides, and I would be more than happy to kind of turn it back over to Karina and have some time for any questions.
Jeff, thank you very much for your talk. That was great. We have some questions from the audience and colleagues that we definitely appreciate your input on. The first question that we just got from an audience member is that this is obviously a great tool for identifying both small and large-scale loading and mitigation. USDA, EPA, and others have had concerns about privacy of individual farmers' information, particularly related to enforcement of the Clean Water Act and polluted discharges. Has this come up with regard to the abilities of this technology and tool, and how is the Chesapeake Conservancy dealing with it?
Sure, that's a great question, and it definitely has come up, and we're very, very cognizant of the privacy issues. Throughout everything that we're doing, we're not putting any landowner names in, which definitely doesn't solve all of the issues. But what we're trying to do is provide the solutions to be able to do very prioritized actions that will generate the largest returns. As different regulations come down, as different programs are put in place by people like NRCS or USDA or the EPA, our goal is to try to have a performance-based funding structure or to prioritize projects that are going to deliver the most results. We're not looking at this as an enforcement tool necessarily to say you are the big polluter, you are the one who's causing all of the trouble. We're trying to say if we have a willing landowner who wants to do a project, how do we get the best project possible coming off of this landscape? All of these tools that we're developing, like the web tools, are for partners who have the ability to do this type of work already. This is just facilitating it, and it's looking at a subset of the information that you would need. None of this you would be able to look at and say this is an enforceable, something is enforceable out of it. This is a planning tool. It always requires site assessments. This is to try to say, how do we begin to identify where the priorities are so we can make sure that our field staff and the established practices that are in place are being directed to the places where we're going to have the best benefits coming out of it.
Great. Zooming out just a bit, the tools and models that you described in the presentation have a range of underlying environmental, social, and economic values. Can you speak to how your team at the Chesapeake Conservancy evaluated and prioritized these range of values and weighted them in your models?
I'm not sure if we're talking about the models here or on our website. I don't know if the person asking the question might be able to iterate that, but what we're looking at, the different values on this existing models, we're looking at the land cover composition, we're looking at the amount of flow accumulation that we have.
I guess building on that question, another question that came in that touches a bit on this is that these technologies have largely focused on maximizing environmental benefits, for example, surface runoff. Are there opportunities to adapt these technologies to address more social benefits like green spaces for low-income communities?
Absolutely. Absolutely, and we would love to do that. We're a small organization. I have 9 people on my team, which is large for a small organization, but we are kind of dependent on the funding that we have and the projects that we have. So we would absolutely love to explore those types of things, and are looking at a little bit. We're doing some work up in the city of Baltimore to try to identify where vacant lots could be restored to urban parks and create new green space in an urban area. We've also been working with we built a tool basically called a park finder, where you can put in your address or your location and it'll show you all the parks near you, including walking directions, what amenities they have. It's similar to the Trust for Public Lands Park Score, if people are familiar with that. It's just providing kind of a dynamic interface looking at all the parks within 5, 10, 15 minutes. Social issues are very much on our mind, and are definitely creating new public open space and green space is really core to our mission. So we definitely are using these tools to try to say, both in an agricultural landscape, but more importantly, in this case, the suburban or urban landscape, where are the opportunities for restoration or conservation that are going to provide that green space.
Great, thanks for that answer. On another note, there are members in the audience interested in adapting this system in other parts of the country. You've clearly gotten folks very excited. Just to clarify, will states, organizations outside of your partners and region have access to this technology? And to add to that, could you give a ballpark figure for how much it would cost to fully implement a similar system for a county of similar size on the West Coast?
So we are currently looking at expanding this potentially nationwide. So the land cover data sets that we are producing now, it works out to be between $15 and $20 a square mile to generate that land cover data. So you can do the math depending on how big your county is. We are currently in the process, and like I said, the working with Esri and Microsoft Research and Hexagon to move this to a cloud-based infrastructure that will greatly reduce that cost. The goal would be to be able to generate this information very quickly. Based on our current testing, you could do the land cover for an entire county potentially in as little as 2 weeks to be able to generate that information. So it's really, really promising. And we would love to talk with people who are interested in this in other landscapes as well, to talk about what we could do to help get some of this stuff off the ground in other landscapes, and to generate interest in having this resolution of data at a larger scale, to potentially bring in some larger funders to be able to do this at a much larger scale.
Great. Let's change tracks just a bit and dive into details of the model. Could you talk a bit more about the weighting and normalization techniques that you use for the concentrated flow? A question that came in was, how do you calculate the rates of sediment and nutrients that are flowing off of a given... Sorry, this is an additional question that I can give you later, but just to give you an idea of what folks are thinking. How do you calculate the rates of sediment and nutrients that are flowing off of a given field, and does the type of agriculture and crop management practices affect this, and how do you account for this in your model?
So right now it is a relative weighting. We were very careful to not put in exact numbers because of that variability between crop types, nutrient applications, everything else. What we are looking at is the general land cover types, of saying which land cover types have the highest potential to the lowest potential, and rank them on a score of 1 to 10. What we are trying to do is develop this relative weighting and relative prioritization based on the land cover composition. The modeling that was referenced to the question of bringing in very finite variables at a field scale could definitely be done, and could be done fairly easily, but a lot of that information is protected. So we did not bring that in, and we also didn't want to create conflicting numbers to any of the existing models that had been done by the Chesapeake Bay program that are the basis of watershed implementation plans and a lot of other things that have been contested by some groups. We wanted to make sure that we weren't introducing confusion into that. So at this point, it's a relative weighting. What we're looking at going forward is saying, how could you bring in additional variables such as those that were indicated in the question to improve that the normalized difference flow index and the variability within that.
Great. Now, Jeff, you've highlighted the strengths of the precision conservation tools that you all are working on. Can you speak to some of the limitations of these tools and the web-based platform? Furthermore, how can partners help address these limitations with other tools and resources?
Yeah, so some of the limitations are, we have templates for the web tools, we have that, which helps us to stand up a new tool fairly easily, but we try to customize them based on our partners' needs, and that definitely has some data processing in the back end that you have to do before you can stand up a new data set that's customized for a partner. A big part of our process is to try to work as closely with that partner as much in the early stages to understand exactly what their needs are, to develop something that directly meets their needs and isn't just creating something for the sake of creating something. So as partners who may be interested in some of these tools, start that process kind of defining what exactly they want that tool to look like, what information they want it to include, and if possible, doing some of the background data processing. It'd be much easier for us to stand up a new web tool if all of the data processing had been done on the back end already. And we could work with them to figure out kind of the format, everything that needs to be done on that with that regard.
Great. Now for our last question today. How can professionals and organizations interested in accessing these tools and web-based platform contact your team and work with you all?
Sure. So the best thing to do is to email me, and I apologize, I meant to put up a slide with my email address on the end, but it isjallenby, ALLENBY, at chesapeakeconservancy.org. Feel free to send me an email, and I can definitely talk more about this. If you want to see some of the tools that we are working on, you can go to our website at chesapeakeconservancy.org/apps, APPS, and we have a lot of our web tools that we've developed for partners hosted on that site. So you can kind of see what they look like, see what's interesting, and then please get in touch with me, and I'd love to talk more about this stuff.
Great. And with that, we conclude the talk on using new technologies to identify scale conservation and restoration priorities. Once again, we would like to thank Jeff for joining us today. If you wish to view a recording of this webinar, please visit the CB website or access the recording through YouTube or Yale iTunes. Thanks again for joining us. Until next time, this is Karina Mahon from the Yale Center for Business and the Environment. Hi, Jeff. I'll be with you. One second.
Not a problem.